Ahorra más con Lowe's y lleva cada proyecto al siguiente nivel. Ahorra 15% en una selección de puertas de entradas e interiores personalizadas. Además, ahorra $80 en un kit de 2 herramientas de Wolf de 20 voltios max por $169. Y en el Pro Desk de Lowe's trae tu lista de materiales escrita o en una foto y recibe una cotización en minutos. Agiliza tus proyectos mientras sigues ahorrando con Lowe's. Válido hasta 7/8 hasta agotar resistencia. Selección varía por lugar.
This is the Station for Negotiation podcast episode number 62. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. Today I wanted to talk with you about the timing of pressure in a negotiation and when to apply pressure most effectively. Or put another way, when you pick the moment, you pick who bleeds. And to do that, I want to take a look at a labor dispute we have going on in the United States right now involving Major League Baseball. It's a fight between the players and management, and the collective bargaining agreement in Major League Baseball expires in December 2026, so it's becoming a bit of an urgent fight because we're in danger of losing the 2027 baseball season, or at least a huge chunk of it. But when you look at this dispute, it's really a garden variety business dispute. Now, it involves a ton of money, and there are complications to it. But in the end, this is just a fight between the seller and the buyer about appropriate pricing. So the seller in this scenario, the sellers are the players. They're selling their services. And like any other seller, they want to maximize their return. They want the highest price possible for their services. And the buyers in this scenario are the baseball team owners. And like all buyers, they want to spend as little as possible for the product. So that's the essence of the fight. And it turns around something called a salary cap. A salary cap is basically a limit beyond which the teams cannot spend to pay players on an annual basis. And the owners at this point in Major League Baseball have proposed what they call a hard cap of $245.3 million per team and a floor, meaning the minimum amount that each team can spend, of $171.2 million starting in 2027. Baseball is the only major North American league that does not have a cap at this point of some kind. And the Baseball Players Union, which is probably the strongest sports union we have in the United States, has vowed never to accept a cap. Now, before we go into the main part of the topic here, I wanted to just talk about what a cap is in a little detail. There are two different kinds of caps that the major sports leagues use. The first kind is a soft cap, and that's what the National Basketball Association uses. So there's a limit in the NBA beyond which the teams can't spend. But the thing about the NBA is that limit is riddled with exceptions. And the biggest exception is that a team can always exceed the cap to re-sign its own star players. And in fact, in a recent season, something like 27 of 30 NBA teams were over the cap. So this is not really a wall. It's more of a guideline with a tax attached. If you pay players beyond the cap, you have to pay a luxury tax. So that's a flexible, forgiving version of a cap. And it's not what baseball's owners are asking for. They are asking for a hard cap, no exceptions. So let's take a look at the other two leagues briefly, the National Football League and the National Hockey League. Those leagues have hard caps, and a hard cap is a true ceiling with no exceptions. The NHL probably has the hardest cap of all the leagues. There is no luxury tax escape in the NHL scheme. There's no exception for homegrown players. There's no amnesty, nothing. Every team in the NHL has to land between the floor and the ceiling, period. And that is the type of cap the baseball owners are looking for in this negotiation. They're not asking for the NBA's flexibility. They want the NHL's wall. Here's the heart of the dispute, though. In all of these leagues that have caps, the players agreed to the cap in exchange for something in return. They didn't just accept a ceiling. They accepted it in exchange for a guaranteed share of revenue. So, for example, the NHL splits hockey revenue, as defined in the collective bargaining agreement, 50-50, with 50% of the revenue going to the players and 50% of the revenue going to the owners. And the cap is based on that split. So the players' half gets divided by the number of teams, and there's kind of a percentage multiplier that gets attached to that. And that's how the cap is determined in the NHL. So the cap isn't a number that the owners pick. It's the players' share expressed as a ceiling. So I guess the number one thing I would say in this scenario that we're talking about today is dig into the deal and know which version of the deal you're actually being offered. These two words, salary cap, can describe the NBA flexible scenario or the NHL ironclad wall. Before you accept or reject a proposal, make sure you find out what's really on the table. The label may be identical, but the deal may not be. I'll give you an example from the law world. Most of my life, I've practiced law with my main office in New Jersey, but I also practiced in New York. And in New York, when the lawyers take something called a deposition, which is basically testimony, at the beginning of the deposition, you talk about the stipulations the lawyers are going to agree upon as far as the ground rules for the deposition. In New Jersey, they're pretty standard and they're expressed in the rules. In New York, at least back in the day, I don't know if it's still the same, at the beginning of the deposition, one of the lawyers would look at the other lawyer and say, "Should we have the usual stipulations?" And the other lawyer invariably said yes. I'm not sure anyone knew what the usual stipulations were. I think someone back in the day just started saying that, and everybody, in an effort not to appear stupid, would just agree to the quote-unquote usual stipulations. And I always found that funny because nobody really knew what they were stipulating to, until a lawyer I knew from out of state actually made an issue of it at a deposition when the other lawyer said, "Will you agree to the usual stipulations?" And the guy said, "Well, what are they?" And the first lawyer really didn't know. So my point is, don't just go along with the terminology because you don't want to look stupid. Dig in and ask, what are we actually talking about here? So you have the hard cap and the soft cap scenario. Now, let's talk about the issues being framed here and how they're being framed. Here's what management has to say, what their position is, expressed through their league spokesman, Glenn Kaplan. Here's how he describes the gist of the issue. He says, "The biggest issue we need to solve to continue to grow the game off the field is fixing the payroll disparity unseen in any other major U.S. sport. Ultimately, the game is about hope and competition, and too many fans in too many markets have too little hope their team has a fair chance to win. Fans overwhelmingly support a salary cap and floor like in the other leagues." Okay, I'm not sure that fans overwhelmingly support a salary cap and floor. I'm not sure how many of them understand the implications of those words. This is me talking, Gene, not the league spokesman. But that's the way the league is framing this power disparity and the need for better competition. And what's causing this is the big market teams like the Los Angeles Dodgers, the New York Mets, the Yankees, the Boston Red Sox are spending an enormous amount of money that the smaller market teams or the less powerful teams are not spending. So, for example, the Dodgers are spending something like 5 times the salary that the Miami Marlins are spending. Now, the Mets spent a ton of money this year, but it hasn't helped them at all because they're terrible. But this is the issue as expressed by Major League Baseball. Meanwhile, the players and the players' union don't look at it that way. And here's what Juan Soto of the Mets had to say about this. And we talked about Juan Soto and the negotiation of his own contract in a prior episode. Soto said, "I don't think it's right to have a cap. Baseball is doing great. We've been increasing every year. It's been great for baseball. We are in the best moment in baseball right now in all kinds of ways. Why should we have a cap?" David Peterson, who's another Mets player, and he's the union rep for the Mets, basically was much more succinct. He said, "It's ridiculous." He said, "A cap works in basketball in that way because they don't have as many guys as we have. So you have a lot less guys for the pot to go around. And that's a league where one or two people on the team pretty much sell the team. That's a lot harder to do in baseball." So what you really have here is the owners framing the issue as competitiveness. We need to ensure competitiveness. And the players are framing this as a pay cut. They're saying the management is crying wolf and saying they need all these major concessions from us, but they're not really explaining why based on their financials. So the players want proof, and so far, we're very early in the negotiation, but so far, the owners are not willing to give it. Now, to understand the context of this fully, I want to go back to 1994, because that's the last year we had a full-blown Major League Baseball labor dispute. It resulted in a strike by the players, and the playoffs in the 1994 season were lost. There was no World Series for the first time since 1904. And the owners took a bath. They make most of their revenue from playoff season, or a lot of their revenue from playoff season, and it was washed. The fight that nearly killed baseball in 1994 is the fight that's happening at the negotiation table again this year. So the collective bargaining agreement in baseball, as I said, is expiring in December. Both sides have an obligation to come forward with a proposal to try to construct a new collective bargaining agreement. And the players' proposal, which actually was received first, focused on the issue of competitive balance, which is the issue that was framed by the owners. And what the players offered or suggested was no hard ceiling, no salary cap. We want the luxury tax threshold moved up to $300 million. I think that was like a $60 million increase. So the teams can spend up to $300 million. Above that, they have to pay a tax. What the players are really saying there is, we accept your diagnosis, but we reject what you're proposing as a cure. Because remember, what the owners are proposing is a hard cap of $245 million. So here's how this went in 1994. And let me tell you, the 1994 labor strife really hurt baseball's popularity for a couple of years, and it led to the steroid era in baseball, where players were taking massive amounts of performance-enhancing drugs, and the owners were looking the other way because baseball had been struggling since the labor problem in 1994, and the fans loved long home runs hit by muscle-bound players. And so the owners looked the other way and didn't enforce the rules or create rules prohibiting the use of steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs. But that strike caused some damage to the game. Here's a story from my own personal life. I lived in Chicago for 4 years when I was younger, and I had a friend who was a diehard White Sox fan. He loved the White Sox. I don't know how many games he went to a year. I'm guessing about 30 games. He just lived and breathed White Sox baseball. This 1994 scenario, the strike that cost the World Series, angered him so badly that he said right before the strike to me that if they go out and strike and if we lose the rest of this season, I will never watch a baseball game again. And I said to him, yeah, sure. It's easy to say that, but you're gonna come back like the rest of us. Well, guess what? He never did. My friend has not watched a Major League Baseball game since 1994. Now, that's a pretty extreme example. But I think the fans are going to get aggravated here because they look at the game and they say, you guys are both making scads of money, boatloads of money. Why can't you get along? Why can't you come up with some scenario that allows the season to continue? So there's a public relations issue. But let's look at the timing in 1994 and how the players played it. First of all, realize that in 1994, the collective bargaining agreement had already expired. And during that season, the players were playing on an expired contract and were trying to negotiate a new one as the season went on. And the players eventually said if we don't get this worked out, we're going to go on strike. So on June 14th, 1994, the owners proposed a salary cap as part of the new collective bargaining agreement. And the players didn't immediately strike. They didn't strike in June. They didn't strike in July. They let the season go on. And then on August 12th, 1994, late in the season, with the pennant races picking up and the playoffs right around the corner, they went out on strike. And this is what I mean by the timing of pressure. Because at that moment in 1994, when the players went on strike, that was the precise moment that a baseball season turns into money. You get playoff revenue, you get World Series broadcast money. It's the most valuable inventory of the entire year, and it was right there within the grasp of the owners when the players went on strike. And by striking in August, the players didn't threaten to lose just a few regular season games. They were threatening to vaporize the owner's biggest payday. And then on September 14th, the unthinkable happened. Because of the labor strife, the commissioner of baseball canceled the World Series. So the timing of the players' blast was timed to cause major financial damage to the owners and create concessions. So a lesson there is to aim your damage, to time the timing of your pressure as perfectly as possible. A threat is only as strong as where it lands. The 1994 players didn't have more leverage in August than they did in April when the season started, but they had better aimed leverage. It was the same weapon, but it was pointed at the other side's most valuable moment, and it worked. So the owners later, in February of 1995, withdrew their demand for a cap, and the strike officially ended on March 31st, 1995, which saved the 1995 season when a federal judge you might have heard of, her name is Sonia Sotomayor, she's now on the Supreme Court, she issued an injunction restoring the old work rules. And the final deal at that time in 1995 had no salary cap. So you can see how important timing is. Now, the issue here is that the owners are actually holding the cards at this point. Let me explain. The owners lost the negotiation in 1994 because the players controlled the timing. So the owners learned their lesson because look at the way this is now set up. The current agreement expires on December 1st, 2026. And if there's no deal by then, the owners are not going to wait for a strike. They are going to lock the players out, preventing them from working. I think that's where this is heading. And this is the whole game in one move. A strike is the players withholding labor, but a lockout is the owners refusing to allow the players to work. They produce the same empty stadiums, but it's not the same weapon because they detonate at different times. A lockout in December lands in the dead of winter. So there's no games going on there, baseball games. There's no gate revenue. There's no broadcast money on the line. Nothing is bleeding yet. But the lockout just sits there quietly while the players go without paychecks and the owners lose almost nothing. The pain builds slowly, and I think it builds on the players first. But the closer we get to April, it's going to shift and the pressure is going to start to be applied to the owners. A lesson here is don't just choose your weapon. You have to choose your clock. If you control the calendar, you control the negotiation. Here, by locking out in December, instead of waiting for a strike in August, the owners are moving the moment of damage from their most valuable date to their least costly one. It's the same standoff, but the owners are controlling the calendar now, and the party that controls when the damage starts controls who's going to feel it first. And we're almost certainly looking at a lockout. This leads me to the next kind of question. Let's pull it out of baseball. Let's just look at it as a general business negotiation. At what point does it make sense to go nuclear in a negotiation? By walking out, by by saying we're going to take our business elsewhere, by resigning, by blowing up a deal. When does going nuclear actually make sense? And there are a few conditions that have to be considered. First, going nuclear makes sense when the status quo is worse than the disruption you're going to cause. So in 1994, the players believed that a cap was a permanent structural loss for them, whereas a lost season was just temporary pain. When the thing you're being asked to accept is worse than the explosion, that's when you detonate your bomb, right? Second, you might go nuclear when you control the timing of the damage. Never, ever trigger a blast when it hurts you the most. In 1994, the players struck in August because the blast hit the owners. The owners are going to lock out in December this year, I think, because the blast, at least initially, is going to hit the players. They're going to lose their paychecks at a time when the owners aren't really generating a lot of revenue. So whoever picks the moment picks the pain and picks who's going to experience the pain. Third, you might go nuclear when your reputation for resolve is itself the prize. I'll say that again. You might go nuclear when your reputation for resolve is itself the prize. In 1994, the players didn't just win a new contract. They proved they would burn a World Series rather than accept a salary cap. And that credibility is exactly why 30 years later, the union can say never, will never accept a salary cap and be believed. So there are times when you have to hold the line. And fourth, you might go nuclear when you genuinely run out of alternatives, right? If you go nuclear too early or too often and you become just the person who always quits, right? Detonation, which is what I'll call this, the maximum use of your leverage, is a question of timing. It should never be a tantrum. It should be a well-considered move. Going nuclear happens because you want to create deterrence. It should never happen out of anger. The credible willingness to detonate your bomb is what usually makes detonation unnecessary. If you use it just as a reaction to feeling cornered, you're wasting it. You have to use it as a calculated choice about timing and credibility, and then you may never need to use it at all. Now, I want to go to an article in The Athletic about this labor dispute. It appeared in the January 1, 2026 issue of The Athletic, an article written by Evan Drylick, and the name of the article is MLB Salary Cap Would Mean Pay Cut for Players and Eradication of Amateur Signing Bonuses, Union Says. And I want to go through this because it gives clarity to the issues being faced and as to how each side is framing the issues. Here's what the article says at the beginning. Bruce Meyer, the interim head of the Major League Baseball Players Association, said Monday he was very surprised by the details of the salary cap proposal owners made 4 days earlier. The union's analysis of the offer showed players would make less money overall and that amateur players who turn pro would be particularly hit hard. I thought they would try harder to make it look good, and they didn't even do that, Meyer said on a video conference call with reporters. Owners are framing the push for a salary cap around a desire to improve the sport's competitive balance. Players, however, have long opposed a cap system on economic grounds and others, setting up a contentious labor battle. So a couple of things here. You see how both sides are framing the issue, right? Again, the owners are saying this is about competitive balance, and the players are basically saying we're bringing in a lot of money and they are trying to prevent us from getting our fair share, right? That's how this is being portrayed to the public. But I thought I'd mention one other thing about this. And one of the beauties of sports negotiation is they play out in the front pages of the papers so you can see what's going on in real time because they're negotiating in public. But Myers says, I thought they would try harder to make this look good, but they didn't even do that. I'm sure this is a public relations view he's taking, because obviously Meyer and the players negotiating team realize this is a first offer from the owners, and the first offer is always going to be lowball. It's going to be an extreme offer, and we have some negotiating that we have to do. But here's the problem here, and this is what I mean when I talk about framing. The players cannot get involved in an argument over what an acceptable salary cap would be. They can't do that, because once they do that, the owners have won this negotiation, because the owners are going to get their salary cap. The players have to avoid that structure of the negotiation. They can't, if they're going to achieve their goals, be involved in a discussion over what an acceptable salary cap would be. The players have to turn their attention to the luxury tax and make this an argument only about the luxury tax, so that if there is any kind of cap, eventually it's an extremely soft cap, sort of like the NBA has. Now, we've had discussions about this in prior episodes when we talked about the WNBA labor negotiations. Any type of system of compensation now in professional sports is going to involve some division of the revenue. And the key question is, how is revenue going to be defined? So going back to the athletic argument, here is what the article says. Cap systems typically come with a revenue split and agreed upon distribution of the overall money the sport takes in. Major League Baseball proposed players and owners start out with an even 50-50 split, but the union said players already earn more than half. Using the MLB's definition of revenue and player share as set forth in their proposal and their presentation to us, player share under their proposal would go down, Meyer said. Player share for this season, 2026, is projected to be well over 50%, using, again, MLB's definition of revenue and what counts against the player's share. Had MLB's proposal been in place in 2026, players, we estimate, would lose over $500 million. Glenn Kaplan, an MLB spokesperson, responded with a statement as follows. Our salary cap and floor proposal addresses our fans' concerns by leveling the playing field while sharing baseball revenue with the players 50-50 like the other leagues. Under our proposal, Major League players would receive more compensation in year one of the system than in 2026. We are ready to listen if the Players Association wants to counter our proposal at the bargaining table. Now, Kaplan here, this is Gene again, not the article, the MLB spokesman, he's kind of dodging the issue, because what the Players Association is saying is, if we're going to talk about a revenue split, we have to talk about how revenue is defined. Remember the discussion we had during the WNBA podcast. Is it net revenue or is it gross revenue? Because if it's net revenue, that means ownership can take items out of the revenue calculation that benefit them, like building stadiums, like promotional expenses, like perks for league executives. So again, as we discussed in the WNBA, if you're going to have a discussion about revenue, you better be crystal clear about how that number is calculated. Back to the athletic article. Two discrepancies are at play here. Many of the fights that await the players and owners will center on how different areas of spending are counted, and the first discrepancy is in that category. Meyer argued that the share of money that goes to the players or the owners, in this case the 50-50 split MLB is proposing, doesn't tell you anything unless you know how share is defined. People should be aware that their proposal deducts billions of dollars in expenses, Meyer said. It's not even a real 50%, close quote. So here what we're talking about is the word game. You know, when you say we're going to split revenue 50-50, that sounds fair to the public. But it all turns on how that term revenue is defined, and that's a fight in this negotiation. Back to the athletic article. The second discrepancy centers on whether big leaguers should care if newly minted minor leaguers make less money. Because if the player's overall share is coming down in the league's proposal from above 50% as the union says it is, to 50%, yet MLB players themselves are not taking salary cuts, then the difference is owed to a change elsewhere. The union expects that the league is planning to propose greatly reducing the $600 million that clubs pay annually to domestic and international amateur signees, the top prospects from schools throughout the United States and other countries, such as the Dominican Republic. So what we're looking at here is implications that ripple down the line from this definition of revenue and this supposed 50-50 revenue split. All of that needs to be taken into consideration in this negotiation. And really, we haven't heard from the league yet. We may eventually hear from the league. If there's reduced income going on the players' side, what the impact of that is going to be on player development. Because remember, the union doesn't only represent star players, the union represents all players. Now, back to this argument over framing. The article says, the league has argued that the union's opening proposal, which would raise the first tier of the competitive balance tax to $300 million, a $56 million increase from today, would not improve the sport's parity. The league accused the union of actually offering to make it easier for the Los Angeles Dodgers, the two-time defending World Series champions, to continue to outspend everyone. Quote, for example, under the union's proposal, the Dodgers would pay less in luxury tax payments, giving them an additional $70 million to spend on payroll, close quote, Kaplan of Major League Baseball said last week. Meyer, the union representative, fought back against that idea generally on Monday. They've said, well, but your tax proposal, the tax threshold is so high that would reduce the amount of luxury tax proceeds, Meyer said. It's the complete opposite of what the league argues otherwise. When the league tries to make the disparities look greater, they actually include those luxury tax proceeds as part of spending, even though half of it goes directly to smaller market teams. Close quote. So this goes to the issue of making sure you understand how the other side is calculating its numbers. Numbers look objective, but in a negotiation, they rarely are. So here what the league is doing is they're taking the luxury tax payments that these teams have to pay for exceeding a ceiling, and they're including that in their calculations of team-by-team salary. So they're saying if the Dodgers have to spend, let's just pull a number out of the air, $100 million in luxury tax, that should be counted as part of the salary that the Dodgers are paying to their players. And the union is saying that's ridiculous because the luxury tax doesn't go to the players. It gets redistributed to all teams, including small market teams. So you have an argument over how the counting is going to be done. Back to the article. Last week, MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred referenced a $446 million gap between the Dodgers and the team with the lowest payroll in baseball, the Miami Marlins, from last season. Manfred described that gap as an unfair fight, but the union doesn't think $446 million is the best figure to use because that amount includes player payroll as well as how much the Dodgers paid in luxury taxes. So there you go. The article goes on to say it's undoubtedly the case that the Dodgers had to pay a luxury tax bill for 2025 of about $169 million. What the union argues is that luxury tax payments are not payroll because some of that money goes right back to the teams. So what the union really wants here is smaller market teams to spend more. That's the bottom line of this. And here's how Meyer, the union spokesman, describes this. He says, every team has the ability to do what the Milwaukee Brewers are doing, what the San Diego Padres have done, or what Tampa Bay has always done, meaning spend more money to be competitive. One of the things I find kind of ironic in a perverse way, if Team X decides we're not going to spend money on players, well, that increases the disparity in payroll, right? They can themselves increase the disparity by choosing not to spend. We want to encourage more San Diegos, Meyer continued. meaning he wants the small market teams to be spending more. And here's how the article concludes. What remains to be seen is whether the sides can find a way to play a full 162-game season in 2027. If the owners stick to a cap, games could wind up canceled. The last time owners proposed a cap was in 1994, when a 232-day strike canceled the 1994 World Series. Our union has never been broken and never will be, Meyer said. You can take away a different lesson from our history, but that would be a big mistake. And so here you go. Battle lines have been drawn. As I record this, we're at the opening phase of this negotiation. And by the way, you may ask, okay, one side has one idea, the other side has another idea. Why don't they just hand this over to a third-party neutral, like a retired judge, and say, hey, we're stuck. Can you craft a fair deal for us? That sounds kind of obvious, right? I have to admit it was my first thought. But let me tell you why it doesn't happen, and because the reason really goes to the essence of the whole dispute. Let's start with a distinction that runs through every dispute you will ever have. There are disputes of right and there are disputes of interest. A dispute of right has a knowable answer measured against some agreed upon standard. For example, does this contract entitle the player to free agency? Was this grievance handled the way the rules require? You can hand that dispute to a neutral because there's a yardstick in place to apply, an agreed upon yardstick. That's what happened in 1975 when an arbitrator struck down the reserve clause. We talked about that in a prior episode. And in 1995, when a federal judge applied the law and ended the strike. Very simple. There were questions, there were answers, there was an agreed upon standard to apply. But a salary cap argument is not that. A salary cap is a dispute of interest, not what does the rule say, but what should the rule be. And if you ask a retired judge to set the fair player's share of revenue, and she has nothing to anchor it to, what's fair? 50%? 57%? 60%? Who knows? Every point, by the way, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's no principle that compels one number over another. So whatever the judge or arbitrator or neutral picks is just going to be one person's preference dressed up as justice. There's no yardstick, only a choice about who gets the money. And here's the deeper reason why you don't use a neutral. Each side here believes that its own leverage will beat the judge's midpoint. You know, a neutral is going to have an understandable wish to try to split the baby, so to speak. And the neutral wants to be fair to both sides. And almost by definition, they're going to land somewhere in the middle. But the owners don't think they're going to end up in the middle. They think a lockout is going to grind the players down by spring. And the players don't think they're going to end up in the middle either. They think the owners are going to blink instead of torching an entire season, including the playoffs. You only submit your dispute to a split the difference neutral when you're afraid you'll do worse than the middle on your own, right? Both sides here think they're going to do better. So the fair compromise to each of them is a worse deal than the actual fight. And there's even a trap in just asking. The moment a judge floats a fair number, that becomes a public reference point. And whichever side it favors is going to wave it around like a flag. And the other side is going to have to be in the position of arguing that the fair deal that this neutral put together is not fair at all. So you've kind of created an anchor that you can't walk back. And then there's an accountability problem on top of that. A union leader who negotiates a deal can tell the union members, I fought, and this is the best deal we can get. But a union leader who hands the pen to a stranger and comes back with a deal can't survive the question, why did you let someone else decide? So that's the fight. I mean, that's why this can't be handed to a third-party neutral right now, because there's no standard for the third-party neutral to apply. What's the takeaway at the end of this situation? You, my listeners, are probably never going to cancel a World Series, but you are going to have to negotiate a contract or a raise or a partnership or a separation. And the lesson of 1994 versus now is relevant to all those situations. Whenever you're handed a threat, like a deadline, don't just ask, how big is the threat? Ask, when does the threat really land and on whose calendar? A deadline that falls in your busy season is a different animal than the same deadline in your quiet season. So if you can move the moment of damage onto the other side's most expensive day or off your own, you've changed the entire balance of power without changing a single dollar figure. The owners could not win the cap fight in 1994 because they let the players choose the day. 30 years later, they've taken the calendar back. Whether it's enough, we're going to find out by next spring. We open this episode by talking about 1994 and the players who understood that the cap fight wasn't necessarily won by the loudest argument. It was won by the best chosen moment, right? The players waited until the damage would land where it hurt the owners the most, and they blew up a World Series to prove that they meant it. That's the way that went in 1994. But now, in 2026, the owners are holding the calendar. This breakup is going to happen in December, not in August, and it's going to be a lockout instead of a strike. So it's the same standoff, but with the clock turned around to face the other direction. So when your own moment comes in a negotiation, when you're deciding whether to walk or to wait or to pull the trigger, don't ask only whether your threat is real. Ask, when does it go off and who's going to be standing closest when it does? Because in the end, the weapon was never the cap. It was never the strike. It was never the lockout. The weapon was the calendar. Whoever picks the moment picks who bleeds. I want to close this episode by referring to, if you're interested in following the strike, one of the best resources that you'll find is Kelly Franco. Kelly is a lawyer in Connecticut who's also active in sports media. Her social media handle, I think across multiple platforms, is @3inningfan. That's spelled out the word 3, inning, INNING, fan, FAN, all one word. Kelly's been tracking the strike and the negotiations, and she has some episodes on her social media channels about it. And I think she's going to continue tracking it as this goes on. So if you're looking for a good resource to follow, Kelly Franco, 3-inning fan, great resource to follow. And folks, that's all I have for you today on the Station for Negotiation. So this is Gene Killian signing off once again and reminding you of two things. First, there's no crying in baseball. And second, negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's @STN4Negotiation. That's @STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/Station4Negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/Station4Negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at @Station4Negotiation. Again, that's @Station4Negotiation. On LinkedIn, Station4Negotiation podcast. Again, that's Station4Negotiation podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at @Station4Negotiation. That's @Station4Negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.